The Homeowners Association fined me $2,000 for refusing to become a member. 5 days later, they found out I owned the building where they had been holding board meetings for years. Looking back, the money was never the real story. The real story began with one question nobody thought to ask. It was a warm Thursday evening when I walked into the old brick community center at the entrance to Pine Ridge Estates. The place felt exactly the way it always had. Fresh coffee was brewing near the back wall. Someone had left a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies beside the pot. Neighbors were catching up after work, while folding chairs scraped softly across the floor. If you had walked in without knowing better, you would have thought this was just another quiet community meeting. Rebecca Collins made sure it looked that way. She stood near the front, greeting residents by name, laughing with board members, thanking volunteers, making everyone feel like they were part of something important. Then she spotted me. Her smile stayed exactly the same, but her hands immediately settled on the folder waiting beside the microphone. She had been expecting me. "Daniel Harper," she said before I had even reached an empty chair. Conversations faded one after another until the room became completely still. Rebecca lifted a letter printed on official HOA letterhead. "The board has approved an immediate compliance fine in the amount of $2,000 for your continued refusal to satisfy mandatory membership requirements." She walked over and handed me the notice herself. "This could have been avoided," she added, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Every homeowner benefits from this community. Every homeowner shares the responsibility of supporting it." I unfolded the letter. Everything about it looked professional. My name, my address, the amount due. Even the payment deadline had been highlighted in yellow. Someone had spent time making sure it looked convincing. I folded it once, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and said, "Thank you." Rebecca blinked. Just once. It was almost impossible to notice unless you were standing where I was. She had expected an argument, maybe a complaint. At the very least, she expected me to defend myself. Instead, I thanked her. "Is that all?" she asked. "For now," I replied. A few people shifted in their seats. Rebecca waited another moment, almost giving me permission to make the scene she had clearly prepared for. I stayed exactly where I was. There would be a better time for questions. She finally turned back toward the audience and continued the meeting. Landscaping bids, parking complaints, holiday decorations, committee reports. One item blended into the next while I quietly listened. Every so often my eyes wandered toward the stone fireplace at the front of the room. Hanging above it was an old bronze plaque. I had noticed it since I was a kid. Most people walked past it without ever looking up. That evening was no different. When Rebecca opened the floor for homeowner comments, she glanced in my direction again. "Mr. Harper," she said with an easy smile, "would you like to address the board?" I stood slowly. Every chair seemed to creak at once. "Just one question," I said. "Are you absolutely certain the association owns this building?" A few people laughed. One board member leaned back with a grin as if the answer was too obvious to deserve discussion. Rebecca never even glanced at the other directors. "Of course we do," she answered immediately. "This is the Pine Ridge Estates Community Center." I nodded once. "Thank you." Then I sat back down. That was it. No speech. No debate. No dramatic exit. Rebecca smiled as though she had just won an argument that never actually happened. 10 minutes later, the meeting adjourned. People gathered around the coffee pot. Someone reached for the last oatmeal cookie. Conversations drifted toward the upcoming Harvest Festival, football scores, and weekend plans. Nobody paid any attention as I walked outside into the cool evening air. Before getting into my truck, I turned around for one last look through the front windows. Rebecca was laughing with another board member beneath the bronze plaque over the fireplace. Not one person looked up at it. Not one person stopped to read the name engraved there. They all believed the building belonged to the association because that was the story they had always been told. They had never asked for proof. The strange thing was, neither had I. Not until the board decided to find the man whose family had quietly been paying the property taxes on that very building for more than 20 years. I slept better than most people would have expected that night. A $2,000 fine sounds like the kind of thing that keeps someone staring at the ceiling until sunrise. It never did. The money was not what bothered me. Rebecca's answer was. She had not paused. She had not checked with the other board members. She had not even looked uncertain for a second. "Of course we own this building." It rolled off her tongue like something she had repeated 100 times before. Maybe she had. The next morning, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. Same HOA logo. Same clean formatting. This one included payment instructions, late fees, and a warning that additional enforcement would begin if I ignored the deadline. I carried it inside, set it beside the first notice, and poured myself a cup of coffee. 2 letters. Same message. Different day. My father used to keep every important document in a gray metal filing cabinet in his workshop. He never trusted memory when paperwork would do. Paper does not get emotional, he liked to say. That is why it usually wins. I smiled when I remembered that. Then I slipped both notices into a folder instead of throwing them away. Before lunchtime, an electronic copy landed in my inbox. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, someone taped a bright orange violation notice to the gate at the end of my driveway where everyone driving past could see it. I walked outside, peeled it off, folded it neatly, and carried it back into the house. No sigh, no complaint, no angry phone call. Just another piece of paper joining the others. They were building a file against me. They just did not realize I was quietly building one too. Saturday morning found me wandering the aisles of the local hardware store looking for replacement hinges for an old pasture gate. Halfway through the lumber section, I heard someone call my name. Daniel. It was Frank Wilson pushing a cart loaded with paint supplies. He slowed to match my pace. Word gets around fast in this neighborhood. I laughed. It usually does. He hesitated before asking what was obviously on his mind. Why not just pay the fine and move on? It was a fair question. Probably the same one a dozen other people had already asked each other over coffee. I rested one hand on the shopping cart. Frank, have you ever signed something without reading it? He grinned. Once. Cost me a fishing boat. I laughed. Then you already know why I am being careful. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. That was the end of it. Frank was the kind of man who respected an answer even when it raised more questions than it solved. By Monday evening, the association announced a special meeting to discuss community updates before the Harvest Festival. Officially, that was the purpose. Unofficially, everyone knew my situation would come up again. The room filled quickly. Rebecca stood beside a projector screen showing colorful charts about neighborhood improvements and future projects. She spoke with the same calm confidence as always. Strong communities depend on shared responsibility, she said. Rules only work when everyone agrees to follow them. Several people nodded. 1 or 2 even clapped. Then she changed slides. Unfortunately, one homeowner continues refusing to meet those responsibilities. She never said my name. She did not have to. Everyone already knew. The board voted to increase the penalties if payment was not received before the Harvest Festival. Rebecca thanked them with an approving smile, as though the matter had been settled once and for all. As I walked toward my truck after the meeting, my phone rang. Rebecca. Daniel, she said pleasantly. I wanted to give you one last opportunity to resolve this before the board moves forward. I appreciate the call, I replied. May I ask you something? Certainly. How long has the association believed it owned the community center? There was a tiny pause, barely noticeable, long before I became president. Has anyone ever verified that? Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then she laughed. Daniel, we hold every board meeting there. We maintain the building. We schedule every event there. Of course it belongs to the association. Thank you, I said. You have been very helpful. She waited. I could almost hear her expecting an argument that never came. Instead, I wished her a pleasant evening and ended the call. Driving home, I passed the community center just as volunteers were hanging banners for the Harvest Festival. Children chased each other across the lawn while vendors unloaded pumpkins, hay bales, and folding tables. Rebecca stood near the entrance with a clipboard tucked under one arm, smiling as she directed traffic. She looked completely at ease. Watching her from across the street, one thought crossed my mind. She was absolutely certain she was standing on HOA property. The only problem was, certainty and proof are not always the same thing. I did not drive to the county recorder's office because I thought Rebecca had lied. I drove there because I wanted to know whether anyone had ever taken the time to check. There is a difference. Early Tuesday morning, I climbed the ladder in my garage and pulled down an old cardboard storage box that had not been touched in years. Dust covered the lid, but everything inside was exactly the way my father had left it. He labeled every folder in neat block letters. Survey maps, building permits, tax receipts, utility easements. Near the bottom sat one worn file with faded blue ink across the front. Community Center. I carried it into the kitchen, brushed the dust away with my sleeve, and opened it on the table. The first document was a survey drawn decades before Pine Ridge Estates existed. Behind it came inspection reports, construction permits, handwritten invoices, and photographs taken while the building was still surrounded by open pasture instead of neatly landscaped streets. One photograph caught my attention. My father stood beside the unfinished stone fireplace, holding a coffee mug in one hand while talking to one of the bricklayers. Someone had snapped the picture before he noticed the camera. He was smiling. Not because the building was finished. It was not even close. He was smiling because he loved building things that would still matter years later. I set the photograph aside and kept reading. A few pages later, I found the original warranty deed. The county recording stamp was still perfectly clear. I copied the parcel number onto a notepad, closed the folder, and headed into town. If my father's paperwork was accurate, the county records would tell exactly the same story. The recorder's office looked almost exactly the way I remembered it. Same polished tile floor, same wooden counter. Even Martha Benson was still sitting behind it, her reading glasses balanced near the end of her nose. She looked up as I walked in and smiled. "Daniel Harper," she said. "It has been a while. Longer than I expected, I admitted. I need to verify a parcel. Take all the time you need." She pointed toward the public research terminals before returning to the paperwork on her desk. I entered the parcel number instead of the street address. Street names change. Parcel numbers almost never do. Within seconds, decades of recorded history filled the screen. I started with the oldest filing and worked forward one document at a time. The survey matched the copy in my father's file. The legal description matched. The deed matched. Then I searched the surrounding subdivision. Roads had been transferred. Parks had been transferred. Walking trails, retention ponds, entrance monuments, and common areas all followed clear chains of title into the homeowners association. The community center did not. I searched again, convinced I had missed something. Same result. I searched a third time using a different reference. Nothing changed. The parcel simply never appeared in any transfer connected to Pine Ridge Estates. Martha wandered over carrying a stack of folders. "Find what you needed?" she asked. I stared at the screen for another second before answering. "I think I found what nobody ever thought to look for." She smiled. "Those usually end up being the interesting ones." I ordered certified copies of every recorded document connected to the parcel. While the printer worked, my phone rang. "Michael Turner. I spent the morning reviewing the files you sent me," he said. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think your father kept remarkable records," he replied. "But family records are only half the story. I want to compare everything against certified county documents before we reach any conclusions." I looked toward the growing stack of certified copies beside the clerk's desk and smiled to myself. "You are going to like what I am bringing." Michael laughed. "Good. Come straight over when you are finished." Driving back through Pine Ridge Estates, I passed the community center just as volunteers were setting up for the Harvest Festival. White tents covered the front lawn. Hay bales lined the walkway. Someone was hanging a banner across the entrance while children chased each other between stacks of pumpkins waiting to be arranged. Rebecca stood near the front doors talking with a florist, pointing toward the building with complete confidence, as though every brick belonged to the association. She never noticed my truck rolling past. Why would she? As far as she knew, the board had already won. She had no idea that less than a mile away, inside a quiet county office, a handful of forgotten records had just started telling a completely different story. Michael Turner already had every document spread across the conference table by the time I walked into his office. Certified county records sat beside the files from my father's storage box, lined up in neat stacks like two witnesses preparing to tell the same story. Michael looked up, nodded once, and went back to reading. That was one thing I had always respected about him. He never rushed toward an opinion. He let the paperwork corner him first. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took the chair across from him. For several minutes, the room was almost silent except for the sound of pages turning. Every now and then he underlined a sentence or circled a parcel number, but he never said a word. Finally, he took off his glasses and leaned back. "Tell me something," he said. "Why did your father keep this building when he sold almost everything else?" I looked down at the old photograph lying beside the deed. My father was standing in front of the unfinished fireplace with mortar dust on his boots, and a coffee mug in his hand. Because he never thought of it as real estate, I said. He thought of it as a promise. Long before Pine Ridge Estates existed, the community center was already bringing people together. Church dinners filled the hall every Sunday evening. Scout meetings took over Tuesday nights. Local ranchers held planning meetings there before harvest season. During one brutal winter storm, the volunteer fire department opened the building as a warming shelter after dozens of families lost electricity. Nobody ever asked who owned the place. If the lights were on, the doors stayed open. That was how my father believed a community ought to work. Years later, developers began buying farmland across the county. Survey flags replaced fence posts. Dirt roads slowly became paved streets. One developer eventually offered to buy nearly everything my father owned. He agreed, but only after crossing one parcel off the contract. The community center stayed. Everything around it could be sold. The building could not. According to my father, the developer barely questioned the change. Compared to hundreds of future home sites, one old brick building seemed insignificant. They rewrote the paperwork, shook hands, and closed the deal. My father never described that conversation as a victory. He always said he had simply protected the one thing that mattered most. Michael listened without interrupting. Then he opened another folder. Inside was the original operating agreement signed between my father and the first developer. He slid it across the table. Read the last page. I already knew the paragraph, but this time it felt different. The agreement allowed future residents of Pine Ridge Estates to use the community center for neighborhood activities, while clearly stating that ownership remained with Richard Harper unless a separate purchase agreement was executed at a later date. Michael tapped the bottom of the page with his pen. Do you know what I cannot find? The purchase agreement, I answered. He nodded. Exactly. He reached for the preliminary title report that had arrived earlier that morning. Every major transfer connected to Pine Ridge Estates appeared in perfect order. Developers changed. Builders changed. Roads, parks, retention ponds, walking trails, and common areas all moved into association ownership over time. The community center never did. Michael compared the report against the certified county records one more time before quietly closing both folders. Daniel, he said, if the final title opinion confirms this, then there really is no ownership dispute. Then what is there? I asked. A small smile crossed his face. A misunderstanding that lasted a very long time. We spent another hour checking legal descriptions, parcel numbers, tax records, and survey maps. Every page confirmed the one before it. There were no missing deeds, no hidden amendments, no forgotten transfer buried in another filing. Just decades of people repeating the same assumption without ever checking whether it had been true. As I gathered the papers, Michael stopped me. Do not call Rebecca. She keeps sending notices, I said. I know. Should I answer any of them? He shook his head. Not yet. Why not? He closed the last binder with a quiet snap. Because the Harvest Festival is this weekend. I waited. The board is about to spend 2 days acting exactly like the owner of that building, he continued. They will organize the event, collect vendor fees, approve reservations, welcome sponsors, and never question the authority they believe they have. He looked at me for a second before adding, sometimes the strongest evidence is not hidden inside old records. Sometimes people create it themselves because they are absolutely convinced they cannot be wrong. Driving home, I passed the community center again. Volunteers were hanging banners across the entrance, while children carried pumpkins toward the front porch. Rebecca stood near the registration table laughing with 2 local business owners, checking names off a clipboard as another vendor handed over an envelope. She looked completely relaxed, completely confident. Watching her from across the street, I realized something she still did not know. Confidence can fill an entire room, but it has never been strong enough to change what is. Written in a county deed. 2 days later, Michael called just after breakfast. The final title report is here, he said. Nothing more. He did not sound excited. He rarely did. If anything, his voice was even calmer than usual. That was enough to tell me something important. I drove to his office without asking another question. The same black binder sat in the middle of the conference table, but this time it was noticeably thicker. Michael had added colored tabs along the side. Start with the chain of title, he said. I opened to the first section. The story unfolded one document at a time. Original farmland. Development plans. sales to builders, streets dedicated to the county, parks transferred to the homeowners association, retention ponds, walking trails, entrance monuments. Every common area followed a clean, predictable path from one owner to the next. Then I reached the community center. The trail simply stopped. I turned another page, expecting the missing transfer to appear. It never did. I checked the parcel number again. Same number, same legal description, same owner, decade after decade. Go back, Michael said quietly. I flipped through the pages a second time. Nothing changed. The community center never entered the association's chain of title because it had never left my family's ownership in the first place. Michael leaned forward and tapped the margin with his pen. This is why assumptions are dangerous. Everyone kept talking about the building. Nobody kept talking about the parcel. He opened the next section. County tax records. Every annual assessment had been mailed to my family's address. Every payment had been received. Every receipt matched the copies my father had saved in that old storage box. I shook my head and laughed softly. All these years, they believed they owned the building. Michael smiled. While you quietly paid the taxes. The room fell silent again. It was hard to argue with 40 years of paperwork. Then Michael reached into another folder and pulled out a document I had almost overlooked earlier that week. The original operating agreement between my father and the first developer. He slid it across the table. Read. The last paragraph again. I did. The language could not have been clearer. Residents of the future subdivision were granted permission to use the community center for neighborhood events. Ownership, however, remained with Richard Harper unless a separate purchase agreement was executed later. I looked up. Did anyone ever sign one? Michael slowly shook his head. The title company searched every recorded transaction connected to this development. There is no purchase agreement because none was ever created. That explained everything. My father had offered access. Somewhere along the way, access became assumption. Assumption became tradition. Tradition eventually became policy. By the time Rebecca joined the board, nobody remembered where the story had started. They only remembered the version everyone kept repeating. Michael opened one final section of the binder. This one did not come from the county. It came from the association itself. Old newsletters, event flyers, reservation forms, rental agreements. The community center had been advertised for birthday parties, retirement dinners, holiday banquets, business meetings, and wedding receptions. Every form listed rental fees, security deposits, cleaning charges. Every advertisement described it as an HOA facility. I slowly closed the folder. They really believed it. I think they did, Michael replied. That does not change ownership, but it explains how the mistake survived for so long. Before leaving, we stopped by the county assessor's office for one final confirmation. A property specialist reviewed the parcel history, compared the legal description against the title report, and printed a certified ownership summary. She glanced at the screen one last time before handing me the papers. Everything matches, she said. Ownership has remained unchanged. For simple words, ownership has remained unchanged. Outside, I slipped the certified summary into the binder just as my phone buzzed. Another message from Rebecca. The board had voted to increase my penalties because I still had not paid the original fine. The notice warned that additional enforcement could begin before the Harvest Festival if I continued refusing to comply. I handed the phone to Michael. He read it once, smiled faintly, and returned it. Still do not answer. Even now, I asked. He looked toward the entrance of Pine Ridge Estates where volunteers were already hanging festival banners in the distance. Especially now, he said. The board is about to spend an entire weekend acting like the owner of that building. Let them. Sometimes people create the strongest evidence against themselves simply by behaving exactly the way they always have. Harvest Festival weekend arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that makes people linger outside a little longer than they planned. By 8 o'clock, the entrance to Pine Ridge Estates was already full of activity. Pickup trucks rolled in one after another. Volunteers carried folding tables across the lawn while local vendors unloaded boxes of handmade crafts, fresh pies, and autumn decorations. The smell of cinnamon, coffee, and smoked barbecue drifted through the cool air. Standing there, you never would have guessed that anything was wrong. It looked like a neighborhood exactly the way my father always hoped it would. Rebecca Collins was impossible to miss. She seemed to be everywhere at once. One minute she was welcoming sponsors at the front gate. The next, she was helping volunteers arrange pumpkins around the stage. Then she was checking vendor lists with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Every few minutes, someone handed her another envelope. Booth fees, sponsorship checks, reservation payments. She thanked each person with the same practiced smile before dropping the envelope into a locked cash box sitting beside the registration table. Watching her, I could not help thinking how completely convinced she was that every decision passed through the board. Around mid-morning, Michael walked over carrying nothing more than a travel mug of coffee. He stood beside me for a while, without saying anything. We watched children race toward the hay maze while a local bluegrass band tuned their instruments near the stage. Finally, he smiled. "Your father would have loved this." I nodded. "This is exactly what he wanted." "Then let people enjoy it," he said. "That is why we are here. We were not there to interrupt the festival. We were there to let it happen." Families had come to spend time together, not to witness a legal dispute. Sometimes the best thing you can do is simply stay out of the way and pay attention. An older couple I had known for years spotted me near the entrance. "Daniel," the husband called. "Come look at the history display inside." We stepped into the lobby where volunteers had arranged framed photographs along one wall. There were pictures from Christmas dinners, charity auctions, 4th of July picnics, and neighborhood cleanup days. Halfway down the display, one photograph stopped me cold. The community center stood alone in the middle of open fields. No subdivision, no entrance sign, no rows of houses stretching into the distance. Just the old brick building beneath a wide blue sky. The date beneath the frame was several years before the first home in Pine Ridge Estates had ever been built. "I always liked that one," the woman beside me said. "It shows how the neighborhood began." I smiled. "Not exactly." She looked at me, puzzled. "The neighborhood came later," I said quietly. "The gathering place came first." Before she could ask another question, someone called her name from across the room. She waved and walked away, leaving me standing in front of the photograph for another moment. Funny how one picture could quietly confirm everything the county records had already shown. Outside, the festival was in full swing. Food trucks stretched along the parking lot. Children waited patiently for face painting while grandparents settled into folding chairs near the stage. Rebecca stepped up to the microphone and welcomed everyone to what she proudly called the heart of Pine Ridge Estates. The crowd applauded. She thanked sponsors, praised the volunteers, and spoke about the importance of supporting the community. Every word sounded sincere. Every word reflected what she genuinely believed. Michael leaned toward me after the applause faded. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Every word." "Good," he said. She just publicly represented the association as the owner and operator of this property. I looked back toward the stage. Rebecca was smiling for photographs with local business owners. Families stopped to thank her for organizing another successful festival. She accepted every compliment with genuine pride. That was what made the situation so remarkable. She was not pretending. She honestly believed the story she had inherited from the people before her. Late that afternoon, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael, even though he was standing only a few yards away talking with one of the vendors. I looked down at the screen. For words. "Everything we need now." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked around one last time. A little girl walked past holding the last oatmeal cookie from the refreshment table while her parents laughed behind her. The same kind of homemade cookies had been sitting beside the coffee pot on the night this whole story began. For the first time, it felt as though the circle was quietly beginning to close. Rebecca was still greeting visitors near the entrance, completely unaware that the next board meeting would not be remembered for another vote or another fine. It would be remembered as the night a few forgotten county records finally spoke louder than years of unquestioned certainty. Monday morning felt strangely ordinary. School buses rolled through Pine Ridge Estates right on schedule. Lawn crews trimmed hedges along the entrance road. A few neighbors walked their dogs past the community center, coffee cups in hand, smiling and waving as if the weekend had ended exactly the way every other harvest festival had. They had no reason to think otherwise. From where they stood, it had been another successful community event. I met Michael just after 9. The black binder was already waiting on the conference table. He rested one hand on the cover for a moment before opening it to the final page. "Read this," he said. The title company's conclusion filled barely half a page. "No recorded conveyance transferring ownership of the community center parcel from Richard Harper or his successors had ever been found. That was it. No dramatic language. No legal gymnastics. Just one simple fact, supported by every certified record we had gathered. I closed the binder. So there is nothing left to prove. Michael nodded. Exactly. From this point forward, the documents speak for themselves. Before lunch, we stopped by the county courthouse to complete one final filing. The clerk compared parcel numbers, checked the certifications, stamped each page, and slid the receipt across the counter. She smiled politely, wished us a nice day, and called for the next person in line. It struck me how ordinary the moment felt. The biggest turning point in this entire story happened without raised voices, flashing cameras, or anyone making a speech. Just ink, paper, and a county seal. Outside, Michael tucked the receipt into his briefcase. Most people think property disputes end in court, he said as we walked toward the parking lot. Most of them end right here. Someone finally reads what should have been read years ago. I laughed. Dad would have liked that sentence. I suspect he lived by it. My phone rang before we reached the truck. Rebecca. I answered on the second ring. Daniel, she said pleasantly. I wanted to let you know the board met this morning. I hope everything went well. It did. Since your fines remain unpaid, the board voted to suspend your access to all association amenities until your account is brought into compliance. I looked at the courthouse receipt still resting in my hand. Funny how official words lose their weight once you know where the facts actually live. Thank you for letting me know, I said. May I ask one question? Of course. Before taking that vote, did anyone review the chain of title for the community center? Silence. Not long. Just long enough to notice. No, she answered. We did not think that was necessary. I understand, I said. Have a good afternoon, Rebecca. She waited, expecting me to argue, defend myself, maybe even lose my temper. Instead, all she heard was the click as the call ended. Michael looked over at me. She still believes this is about unpaid dues. She does. Good. He smiled. Then Thursday is going to surprise everyone, including her. That evening, the agenda for the next board meeting appeared in every resident's inbox. Budget review, holiday decorations, committee appointments. Near the bottom was the item everyone expected. Compliance enforcement update. My name still was not printed anywhere, but it did not need to be. Neighbors had already started talking. At the grocery store, at the gas station, outside church on Sunday morning. Most of the conversations ended the same way. I wonder what the board is going to do next. Nobody was asking the other question yet. I drove past the community center on my way home. The festival banners had already been taken down. Folding tables were gone. The lawn looked exactly the way it had before the weekend began. Through the front windows, I could see the familiar stone fireplace standing quietly beneath the bronze plaque. It had watched generations of meetings come and go without saying a word. Maybe that was fitting. Buildings do not argue. They simply stand where the deeds say they belong. Before turning into my driveway, I caught myself thinking about the last oatmeal cookie sitting beside the coffee pot at Thursday's meeting, then the little girl carrying one away during the harvest festival. Strange what the mind chooses to remember. Maybe because those small moments mattered more than the arguments ever did. Dad used to say that people forget speeches, but they remember how a place made them feel. By this time tomorrow evening, Pine Ridge Estates would finally discover that the community center had never belonged to the board. It had always belonged to the same family that quietly kept the lights on, paid the taxes, and never once asked for credit. The only thing about to change was that everyone else was finally going to learn the same truth the county had known all along. Thursday night's meeting drew the largest crowd I had ever seen inside the community center. People arrived early just to find a seat. By the time I walked through the front doors, every chair was filled and neighbors were already lining the back wall with paper coffee cups in their hands. Someone had brought another tray of homemade oatmeal cookies. I noticed it immediately. The same kind had been sitting beside the coffee pot on the night this whole story began. Funny the details your mind hangs on to. Conversation stopped for a moment when I entered, then quietly started again. Nobody smiled. Nobody frowned. They were simply waiting to see what would happen next. Rebecca Collins stood behind the podium with the confidence I had come to expect. She thanked everyone for attending, congratulated the volunteers who had organized another successful harvest festival, and joked that next year they might need twice as many parking spaces. The room laughed politely. For a few minutes it sounded like every other board meeting. Budgets were approved. Committee reports came and went. Holiday decorations were discussed. Then Rebecca closed one folder, opened another, and looked directly at me. Our final item tonight concerns an ongoing compliance matter, she said. Despite repeated notices and multiple opportunities to resolve the issue, one homeowner continues refusing mandatory association membership. She never needed to say my name. Every person in the room already knew who she meant. Rebecca explained that the unpaid balance had increased, reminded everyone that the board had a duty to enforce its governing documents, and recommended authorizing legal counsel to pursue the next step. Her voice never wavered. She believed every word she was saying. When she finished, she looked toward me with the same practiced smile she had worn the first night. "Mr. Harper," she said, "before the board votes, would you like to respond?" I stood. I left my folder on the chair. My hands were empty. "Only one question," I said. "How many people in this room believe the Homeowners Association owns this building?" Almost every hand went up. Some people raised theirs without thinking. Others glanced around first, then followed the crowd. I nodded slowly. "Thank you." Rebecca smiled. "I believe that answers your question." "Not quite," I said. "It tells me what people believe. It does not tell me what the county recorded." The room became noticeably quieter. Michael stood, picked up the black binder, and walked toward the front without saying a word. He placed it on the board table and opened it to the first tab. "Everything in this binder is a certified public record," he said calmly. "The original deed, survey maps, tax records, the operating agreement, the completed title opinion. Nothing here came from Mr. Harper. Every document came from the county or an independent title company." Rebecca's smile faded just enough for me to notice. One board member reached for the binder. Another adjusted his glasses before reading the first page. Nobody rushed. Nobody argued. They simply kept turning pages. The silence grew heavier with every document. Finally, one director looked up. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "have we ever reviewed these records?" She looked down at the binder, then slowly shook her head. "No." "Did the management company ever provide them?" Another pause. "Not that I know of." Michael waited until everyone had finished reading before speaking again. "The title company reviewed every recorded transfer connected to Pine Ridge Estates. Roads were transferred. Parks were transferred. Walking trails were transferred. Retention ponds were transferred. The community center parcel never was. There is no recorded deed conveying this property to the Homeowners Association. Ownership remained with Richard Harper and later passed to Daniel Harper through his estate." No one interrupted him. There was nothing to interrupt. A retired history teacher quietly walked to the stone fireplace. He looked up at the bronze plaque hanging above it, the same plaque people had ignored for years. This time he read every word aloud. "Dedicated to the community through the vision and generosity of Richard Harper." He looked back at the room and gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I have attended meetings here for nearly 15 years, he admitted. "I never stopped to read this." A woman sitting near the back slowly raised her hand. "If Daniel owns the building," she asked, "who has been collecting the rental fees for birthday parties, holiday dinners, and community events?" The question seemed to settle over the room all by itself. Nobody answered. Rebecca looked toward the other directors. They looked back at the binder. One man quietly removed his glasses. Another rested both hands on the table and stared at the title report for several long seconds. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had disappeared without anyone raising a voice. Rebecca finally took a slow breath. "I believe this meeting should pause until the association's attorney reviews these documents," she said softly. No one objected. As neighbors began filing toward the exit, something unexpected happened. Instead of walking straight to the coffee table, people drifted toward the stone fireplace. One by one, they stopped beneath the bronze plaque and read it for themselves. The little details people had overlooked for years suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with a speech. Sometimes it has been hanging quietly on the wall the entire time, simply waiting for someone to look up. The board's attorney called the very next morning. That alone told me something had changed. If he believed the documents were weak, he would have challenged them over the telephone. Instead, he asked Michael and me to bring the original binder to his office. "I want to review everything myself," he said. There was no tension in his voice, just curiosity. We met shortly after 10. The attorney spread the certified records across the conference table one page at a time. He compared parcel numbers, checked recording dates, reviewed the operating agreement, and matched the title opinion against the county filings. Nobody interrupted him. Even Michael stayed quiet. Nearly an hour passed before the attorney finally leaned back in his chair. He rested one hand on the closed binder and looked at both of us. "I have searched every possible transfer connected to this parcel," he said. "There is not one recorded deed conveying ownership of the community center to the homeowners association." Michael nodded once. "That is exactly what the title company concluded." The attorney slowly exhaled. "Then the association has spent years operating under an assumption that was never supported by the public record." He was silent for another moment before adding something I had not expected. "I do not believe anyone intended to misrepresent ownership. One board inherited the same understanding from the board before it. Eventually, nobody remembered where the assumption began." I appreciated that. It matched what I had been thinking all along. Rebecca had been wrong. Very wrong. But she had inherited a story she never thought to verify. A week later, every homeowner in Pine Ridge Estates received notice of a special board meeting. By the time I arrived, the room was full again, but the atmosphere felt completely different from the night I received the fine. People were talking quietly instead of confidently. Nobody seemed interested in taking sides anymore. They simply wanted to know what the truth looked like. Rebecca walked to the front carrying a single sheet of paper instead of her usual stack of folders. She looked tired, not defeated, just thoughtful. After thanking everyone for coming, she looked down at the page in her hands. "Following an independent legal review of certified county records and the completed title opinion," she began, "the board of directors acknowledges that the Pine Ridge Estates Community Center is privately owned by Daniel Harper." The room fell completely silent. Rebecca continued reading. "Effective immediately, every compliance fine, late fee, enforcement action, and membership demand issued in connection with this matter is withdrawn." She paused, folded the paper once, then looked directly at me. "On behalf of the board, I sincerely apologize." Nobody clapped. Nobody whispered. It was one of those rare moments when a room full of people understands that the simplest words carry the most weight. I stood. "Thank you," I said. "Apology accepted." That was all. There was nothing else to prove. Nothing left to win. The records had already done that. After the meeting, neighbors lingered instead of rushing toward the parking lot. Frank Wilson walked over holding a paper cup of coffee. He smiled before saying anything. "You know what I noticed?" "What is that?" I asked. He pointed toward the stone fireplace. Several people were standing beneath the bronze plaque, reading every word before quietly moving on. One young father lifted his daughter so she could see it better. She slowly traced the engraved letters with one finger while asking who Richard Harper had been. Her father smiled and said, "Someone who wanted this place to be here long before the neighborhood was." I looked away for a second because that answer was better than anything I could have said myself. Over the following month, Michael worked with the association's attorney to prepare a long-term use agreement. It was simple. The community would continue holding meetings, holiday dinners, charity events, youth activities, and neighborhood celebrations inside the building exactly as before. The only difference was that every document now reflected the same ownership the county records had recognized all along. Nothing else needed to change. That was exactly how my father would have wanted it. A few weeks later, I unlocked the front doors just after sunrise for the annual food pantry breakfast. Volunteers began arriving with boxes of pancake mix, folding tables, and coffee supplies. Someone set a fresh tray of homemade oatmeal cookies beside the coffee pot, without realizing they had quietly become part of this story. Children laughed as they helped carry napkins into the kitchen. Retirees argued good-naturedly about who made the best pancakes in the county. The room sounded alive again. Before joining them, I stopped in front of the stone fireplace one last time. The bronze plaque had not moved. It never needed to. What had changed were the people walking past it. They looked up now. They read it. They smiled. Then they carried on with their day. Dad never built that community center so people would remember his name. He built it because he believed every town deserved a place where neighbors could gather without worrying about who belonged and who did not. The fine disappeared. The misunderstanding disappeared. Even the arguments faded with time. But on that quiet Saturday morning, watching families share coffee, cookies, and breakfast beneath the same roof my father built decades earlier. I realized the best ending had nothing to do with proving ownership. The best ending was seeing the building continue doing exactly what it had always been meant to do, bringing people together.